Good morning, everyone. Jane here with the homily for July the 5th. Welcome to the final installment of our 5-week tour through the book of Job. I want to thank Mona for all the work and the wisdom she has shared with us over the past month to get us here. And yes, I do feel some pressure being the one who has the privilege of the final word. But I love the book of Job, especially these last chapters. I hope I can express some of the reasons why I feel like that, and why I think Job is just as relevant for us now as when it was written more than 2,500 years ago. Let's begin with a brief summary of what has happened so far. Job, as his story begins, is a good man, prosperous and blessed with a large family. Then undeserved catastrophe strikes. His livestock are stolen, all his children die, and Job himself is tormented by disease. We are led to question why the innocent suffer, and whether people can love God for God's own sake, or only for what God does for them. It appears that Job can love God without self-interest. He worships God even after these calamities. Still, Job suffers terribly, and he rails against his situation, wishing he had never been born. His 3 friends make unhelpful attempts at consolation, which only infuriate Job. They spout the conventional wisdom of the time. You must have sinned, and God is punishing you for it. These so-called comforters suggest that if Job would just repent and turn to God, he would be restored. The trouble is that Job knows he is an innocent man. He cannot with integrity compromise that position. He pleads for a chance to make his case to God and to receive justice. In this, I'm reminded of David Milgaard, who spent 23 years in prison for a murder he did not commit. Because Milgaard refused to admit guilt, he could not be considered rehabilitated and was therefore never eligible for parole. Job's burning conviction that he is in the right and his lack of contrition put him in a similar no-win situation. But Job's persistence is finally rewarded as God answers him with a dazzling account of utter might and creative power. God's speech certainly puts Job in his place. I hear a sense of humor in God's questions about whether or not Job would care to tangle with Leviathan, that sea monster who represents chaos. Can Job catch it with a fishhook? Can he play with it like a bird or put it on a leash like a pet for his daughters? Lay hands on it, God says. Think of the battle. You won't try that again. But really, what are we to make of God's words to Job? At first glance, I find them very unsatisfying. God does not explain why there is undeserved suffering, nor does God directly rule on Job's own guilt or innocence. And what about Job's final reply to God? He says, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. That sounds as though Job has given up on his quest for justice and followed the advice of his friends after all. Is that why his good fortune is restored at the end of the book? Was the conventional wisdom of his friends correct? If that is all there is to the story, then I think we have followed Job's journey from prosperity to misery and back to prosperity for nothing. So I'd like to suggest an interpretation that makes more sense to me. It hinges on just one sentence in the reading. Job says to God, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. What does it mean to hear of someone? It's a rather remote kind of knowledge, isn't it? I have heard of Winston Churchill and Napoleon. I have read books about them. But that's not the same as knowing them personally or having a close relationship with them. And this is the point that Job starts from in his understanding of God. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, he says. In other words, he knew the oral teachings about God. He had absorbed the accepted religious precepts of his time. But now listen to the second half of that pivotal sentence. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. The word but suggests that something has changed profoundly between the first and second parts of the sentence. Job declares, now my eye sees you. Well, we know from our own experience that seeing is a much richer way of experiencing something than hearing. Think of the difference between listening to a play on the radio or seeing it on the stage. With sight, you can distinguish the characters and interpret movement and gestures. Your eyes effortlessly absorb information that your ears alone would miss. So what exactly does Job mean by saying that his eye now sees God? I think that seeing God is Job's way of declaring that his whole understanding of God has changed. The difference between hearing and sight is an analogy for a profound transformation from having conventional beliefs about God on the one hand to being in a deep personal relationship with God. And that new relationship is so supremely good that it overshadows even Job's suffering and his quest for justice. How has such a transformation happened? I think the key to it is the way that Job becomes increasingly deeply engaged with God as the story progresses. Back in the days of his prosperity, Job was a religious man and a rule follower. When disaster struck, another person might have lost their faith or blamed God. But in Job's case, even in bitterness and distress, he doesn't turn his back on God or become indifferent to him. Instead, he gradually stops talking about God and begins more and more to speak his anger and his lament directly to God. For Job, God is no longer a he, but a you. And God responds by answering Job. That in itself must have been a life-changing experience. What do you suppose Job thought of God's words? To us, they may sound almost harsh, as though God is saying, I am all-powerful and all-knowing. I have more important things to think about than your puny troubles. I hear it differently, more like a parental reassurance. Job, I have the strength to tame even the sea monster. I care about all my creatures. Let me share my strength and compassion with you. We will face this sorrow together. Job's final words, which I've already mentioned, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes, the words that sound like giving up, can also be interpreted in more than one way. According to Marcus Borg, in a book called Reading the Bible Again for the First Time, a better translation of I despise myself is I melt into nothingness. Heard that way, we could see it as a simple statement of humility before God, or perhaps as a melting away of Job's anger and his pride. And we know that the word repent means to have a change of heart or to turn away from something. Some translations say that Job repents of dust and ashes rather than in dust and ashes. So how does Job's statement feel if we say it like this? I melt into nothingness and turn away from dust and ashes. That recasts it as a hopeful avowal of a new direction for Job, moving away from his suffering into a new life, upheld by this deep relationship with God. Now, I think Job's story would be even more powerful if it stopped right there, without the happy ending of restored property, wealth, and children. That would make it more relevant to the life of the world, where much suffering is not reversed, but where God's love and compassion can support us in enduring and even transcending our pain. Job is just one of the many characters in the Bible whose lives are transformed by their engagement and encounter with God. Think of the patriarch Jacob, for instance, wrestling with God by the Jabbok River. Jacob left that encounter limping, but carrying God's blessing and a new name. Saul saw Christ on the road to Damascus, and he rose from that vision with a changed heart and a vital mission to spread the gospel. But we don't need to be a patriarch or an apostle to be changed by God. All we need is to be more like Job, to move away from just hearing about God and toward engaging with God deeply and personally, holding back nothing of our anger or confusion or despair, and pouring out to God both our sorrows and our joys. That is the message I take from this ancient yet timeless story, and I suspect it is one way to an abiding relationship with our God. Amen.